that I am going to make sure your brother's been helping me a lot, like I said, with this, to make sure that every 30 days I check and see whether they've got doctors yet. Because if they don't have doctors, then that's neglect to us, and I'm considering whether or not I sue the government for neglect.
Have you heard back from any conservative, so-called conservative politicians yet to address your problem?
Absolutely not. No.
Well, we'll continue trying to put it on blast, Kayla.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to give everybody the link. We're going to keep in touch. I'm wishing you the best, but you're dealing with a government that is neglectful. All right, people, I was trying not to interrupt because Kayla didn't have headphones and there was a bit of an echo and I didn't want to drive anybody crazy with the echo. But we've got our next guest coming up in a second. But before we do that, there is something going on in Las Vegas, by the way, if you guys are in the neighborhood. And it's actually, I mean, if I were in Vegas, I would be going and documenting in person. But the good news is you can actually watch it on Rumble because it's going to be live streamed. There's a new global sports competition happening in Las Vegas, May 24th, the day after my birthday, people. I'm turning 47 tomorrow. It's unlike anything you've ever seen before. The Enhanced Games brings together elite athletes from around the world competing at the absolute limits of human performance. They don't hide anything. They don't pretend anything. There's complete transparency about what the athletes are putting into their bodies, and you can watch the entire event live on Rumble. The results speak for themselves. Elite weightlifters typically improve strength around 1.5% annually, yet enhanced weightlifting cohort saw strength increases ranging from 8% to 33% in a single camp cycle. That's a 2 to 7 time multiplier on expected gains. And did you know you can purchase the supplements built for Enhanced Games athletes and more? You can get peptides, testosterone. Let me scroll down here so you can see what else they got on their website. You can get it all over there. GLP-1s, all on the Enhanced Games website. Not generic supplements, people. They are performance protocols matched to your biology, your data, and refined over time. Every single ingredient is published. Every dose is explained. Enhanced is for people who are serious about what they put into their body. No guesswork, no averages, just your exact protocol, built with the same standard of care as the athletes competing on the world stage this Sunday, May 24th. Go to enhanced.com, shop for peptides, testosterone, GLP-1s, and more. Get Enhanced. And you can see what's going on here. They got all of the stuff here. And it'll be fun to watch. It'll be on Sunday on Rumble. And the link is in the description, peeps. And now, as if we weren't already black-pilled enough on what's going on in Canada, we're going to bring on a man who's still, I think he's still practicing attorney in Canada. I don't know how anybody survives in the industry of the practice of law in its disheartening nature. Soul-crushing nature. It seems that the bad people get rewarded and the good people get pushed out. I'm going to bring on Shawn Buckley. He's going to introduce himself, but you all know him, or you should know him. Shawn, sir, how goes the battle?
Well, it goes really good. How are you, Viva?
Well, it's been a while. First of all, it's been a while since we've seen each other and a while that we've been trying to get this going. And the timing worked out today, so this is perfect.
I don't think we've actually seen each other since I called you as a witness a couple of years ago at the National Citizens Inquiry.
Absolutely.
Because right. you were at the truckers' convoy and you had a lot of really interesting things to say, and people can still watch your testimony. So
I'll say I was disappointed but not surprised that they didn't call me during the Rouleau Commission. I tried to submit. I believe I tried to submit during that particular one. I forget exactly how they determined the witnesses. I would have loved to have spoken there. I would have loved to have gone up and done it in person. But Shawn, I mean, actually, people might not know your role in the National Citizens Inquiry, who you are, what you're doing up in Canada. Give everybody the 30,000-foot overview.
Oh, yeah,
we're not going to dive into childhood today, but we'll stick to professional. Professional history.
Well, yeah, no, it's probably good for both of us to stay away from the childhood. But I'm a lawyer. I've practiced now for 32 years, primarily on constitutional issues, very high volume trial lawyer. And I kind of was the go-to guy for, decades fighting Health Canada when Health Canada is attacking our natural remedies. So because we're in a total corporate system with regards to our drug regulation, which is a whole different issue. And then after COVID, after those truckers, I decided I couldn't sit still and I had to do something. So I got heavily involved with the National Citizens Inquiry, which was a citizen-led and organized inquiry into all things COVID. So it was unbiased. The commissioners were completely independent of the administration, and they were tasked with listening with an objective mind and coming up with positive recommendations. I think we called on COVID 405 witnesses across Canada, all under oath, and I called over half of those. So, and not that I wanted to, we just had lawyers dropping out as this progressed. So not sure what was happening there, but that's who I am.
What ended up happening? I mean, the Citizens Inquiry prepared its final report. Did it have any, I want to say, political impact? Did any members of Canadian government, MPs, pay any attention to it? Did they do anything with it? I mean, what was the ultimate outcome?
That's a good question. And just so everyone knows, I mean, the report is world class. So, it's unbiased, and you will not read a government report of such high quality. We've had Viva MP after MP tell us that they were told not to participate because we invited MPs, and as we traveled the province, we only had one politician, an MLA in Saskatchewan, that was brave enough to testify. So governments have largely ignored it. They're aware of it, but they've ignored it. But I think, Viva, we are now just, I think, getting to the point where we can have an honest conversation about this. I mean, let's take the legal community as an example. You know how in family law, when, one parent was wanting the COVID-19 vaccine and the other was opposed, the courts of appeal, I mean, Ontario Court of Appeal was really clear about this. They actually said, listen, when Health Canada approves a vaccine, that means it's safe and effective, and basically directed the lower courts to take judicial notice that these COVID-19 vaccines were safe and effective. So that meant if you were the parent that, didn't want your child to take it, like maybe understood your child had a 0% risk of danger from COVID, but a very high risk from these vaccines for children, well, you were going to lose. I mean, unless you were like a multimillionaire and could just spend tons of money and maybe exhaust the other side, you were going to lose because there was an evidentiary burden against you. Well, Viva, that was a complete fraud because, I mean, just ignoring the regular drug approval process, which if anyone wants to read it, just go to our drug regulations, C.08.001. Pre-COVID, there were basically three things. You had to prove it was safe. Yes, so you had to establish the safety profile, you had to establish the efficacy profile, and then the third part isn't in the regulations, but our criminal law dictates it. It's if it's for the general population, the benefits have to outweigh the risks, or you're committing criminal negligence and or homicide for that matter. So pre-COVID, though, the Minister of Health exempted the COVID vaccines from having to prove safety and efficacy and created a whole different pathway for them to be approved. Viva, you didn't even have to submit your safety data to get approved for a COVID-19 vaccine. And, this isn't where we're going to go today, but I bet, I can quote it and maybe be one word off. But the test was that all COVID-19 vaccines were approved of, and listen for the words safety and listen for the words efficacy. They're not there. The test is the minister has sufficient evidence to support the conclusion. And I'll stop there because we're already in trouble. It should say the minister has concluded. Like, this is a mandatory test. If this test is met, Health Canada has to grant. And now we're in a subjective thing. The minister has sufficient evidence to support that conclusion, not even the minister's conclusion. So let's say we're Pfizer. We're now just having to argue for what follows. And again, it's a mandatory test. Minister must grant if this is met. So the minister has sufficient evidence to support the conclusion that the benefits of the drug outweigh the risks, having regard to the uncertainties concerning the benefits and risks, and the urgent public health emergency presented by COVID-19. There's no requirement to prove safety. There's no requirement to prove efficacy, and they weren't proven and couldn't have been proven. But I don't know that we've moved into that field where the courts are ready to accept this. Like, I've just been kind of chomping at the bit to write about this, and then maybe to hold some professional legal training seminars and see if the different provinces will let me present on this to teach lawyers. But I don't know if we're there yet. If for the courts to accept that we basically took judicial notice of a ghost.
I was trying to find some of those decisions where the judges were taking judicial notice to hold one parent's refusal or opposition to get the COVID shot, either for themselves or for their kid, against them, or compelling the kid to do it. I might hit you up for those references afterwards, because those judges should be disbarred. But for those who don't appreciate, judicial notice, judicial knowledge is you don't even adduce the evidence of the fact. You don't have to prove it because it's so patently universally accepted as true that you don't need to prove that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west by way of expert. It's judicial notice. They were taking this by way of judicial notice during these cases, or in 2021, 2022, and stripping parents of parental rights if they were not getting jabbed, refusing visitation, or custody. And those judges have never been punished. I mean, those decisions are now law to some extent. And it's obscene. Were you? I mean, did you practice? You were practicing during this time, during the COVID era, when these cases were going to court?
Yeah, I was. Although I was kind of in the process of phasing down, and I appreciated your comments earlier about the practice of law being soul sucking, because you're always up against this huge machine, and when you're going against the government, I mean, it's so rigged. And especially on constitutional cases, it's so rigged against the citizen that you end up being crushed. So I was kind of phasing out of law and phasing into working, devoting my time to the NHPPA. And then, COVID's happening, and I basically closed my law office and volunteered for 3 years for the National Citizens Inquiry. So I really don't. I'm still a member of 2 bar associations, but I'm not practicing, thankfully.
Yeah, no, it is. You're either fighting a machine like the government, either in the ostrich culling case, or Dan Hartman, Kayla Pollock, or you're in the private practice and you're fighting other lawyers who are morally unscrupulous and don't give a shit about anything that is standards of decency. Whatever you can get away with in the practice, you will. And the system ends up rewarding that, where if you don't do that with which you can get away up to that line, it's as though you're not faithfully and vigorously pursuing your client's interests. And it's a disgusting, disgusting industry. And I understand why people hate lawyers. Now, that said, when we were talking about this, I said, well, what are we going to talk about? Because there were a couple of issues. We're not going to go back to the National Citizens Inquiry. And then you said, Viva, have you heard about UNRIP? Like UNDRIP, which is also funny because it ends in rest in peace. And I'm like, I went down about a 4-hour rabbit hole this morning and started looking into the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And first of all, I saw a bunch of your clips come up on the internet. I saw a number of people, a guy named Vaillant, a Canadian who's sounding the alarm as well. And then, you start looking into this thing, which is known as the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, which unless I've misunderstood, is in fact now part of Canadian law, because, people freak out about these international treaties as to like what the UN or the WHO wants to implement by way of COVID protocol during the next pandemic. I should say pandemic protocol. And when we talk about these things, we say it's fine. The UN can come up with whatever they want. It doesn't become domestic law until it becomes ratified by the local government, the national government. Am I crazy, or this United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, issued by the United Nations, has in fact been ratified by the Canadian government back in 2019 and nobody noticed?
Okay, so no, it's worse than that. So, and the real story is, how is it that nobody knows about this? Because, Viva, I think what this is it's a new way of doing a communist takeover. Because, they're going through the playbook and undermining all the pillars of society. But one of the last things is you have to destroy property rights. And usually they just pass a law and get rid of property rights. This time we're actually going to institutionalize racism, and we're going to overlay Aboriginal title over top of everyone else's title. And I think, so here you're saying, listen, we ratified this in 2019. Well, not only did we ratify it, in 2021, the Canadian government, so Parliament passed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, which is legally compelling the Canadian government to basically fully implement the treaty, and it attaches the treaty as a schedule so that there is zero confusion about what's happening here. So let me just read for your audience 2 parts of Section 26, because I want to talk about property rights. Like there's really 2 UN initiatives that are being, well, one is a World Health Organization initiative. The One Health and UNRIP are going to be used to completely strip Canadians of all property rights.
Now, I'm going to bring it up as you go over this, but just so people understand, this is no longer a case of prospective fear that the government might ratify this UN treaty. It has already been ratified under Canadian law. That's not inaccurate.
Well,
that is accurate.
And they went a step further.
Yeah,
so I mean, once you ratify it in 2019, your international convention is you've now got to implement it. But they actually passed an act in Parliament called the UNRIP Act in 2021, legally compelling the government to implement this treaty. So there's 2 legal mechanisms now that are putting upon the Canadian government these obligations. I'm just going to read to you 2 of them. I mean, it's a long treaty, but I'm going to read to you. So this is,
if I may, actually, it's the Liberal government that did this when they were minority in 2019. They're still, I don't know if they're still technically the minority now, but what was the vote? Maybe I'll look that up while
I did not go into the vote, because back then we would have had the NDP also. And sometimes I am very disappointed in what the Conservatives support and what they don't support. I would like to see a change of government. I would strongly like to see that. But, we don't have any accountability to the populace. And that's what allows all of this to happen. And now the question you need to ask yourself when I read this is, why doesn't anyone know about this? Why isn't this front page news? Why isn't the opposition shouting from the rooftops? Article 26.
I didn't know about this, and I consider myself to be both interested in Canadian news and also the Canadian news that would be of interest to me. And this, for the level of criticism that I've been putting out against the Liberal government in particular, but also the Conservative, I thought I would have known about this. And when I didn't, I was like, yeah, we'll do this, and we'll put this on as much super duper mega blast as we can.
Okay, so do you see that clause 1? So Indigenous peoples, and in the UNRIP Act, it says that we're, for our purposes, we're treating Indigenous people, as the native people defined in Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982. So we are our Inuit, our Indian, and our Métis. So that's what Indigenous peoples for us means in Canada.
And let's clarify that to the non-Canadians. Indigenous Inuit, they're the ones who live up north. The Métis are the ones that some people don't necessarily understand. Those are the ones who have part European, part Indigenous blood, correct?
Yeah, basically French, mainly French blood. And, I'm relying on Leighton Gray says that, it's really 3% of the Canadian population. If you Google it, it says like 3 to 5. But we're talking about a small minority, and this is a big point, because they're placing us into a constitutional crisis, and they are instituting racism over property rights. So Article 26, Clause 1, Indigenous peoples have the right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. Well, in Canada, that's all of populated Canada. Just so there's no mistaking what's happening here. And then, okay, so what does the right of ownership mean? Well, Clause 2 here really helps us out. So Indigenous people have the right to own, use, develop, and control the lands and territories that they traditionally own, use, develop, and control. Like, it's important to understand, we talk about ownership, but Viva, ownership is really just how we describe who controls something, right? Like, let's say you're renting a house, you're not going to be able to move walls around. because you don't have that control. You're just granted the right to live there while you're paying the rent. But the owner at least used to have the right to move walls and put in bigger windows. You know, when I was younger, I always wanted a rural property, you know, either a small farm or acreage. And, you know, there was a time when those people that control Canada wanted us to nation build. I mean, you could get a parcel of land, you could build a house wherever you wanted, you could build a barn, you could drill a well, either a shallow well or deep well. You never needed anyone's permission. We see that was ownership. That's a right of control. Now, rurally, you can't do any of those things I just mentioned, not a single one, without government permission. So you see, you've lost that control. You've lost that ownership. The state keeps reimposing that ownership on you. And how is it that they do that? Well, you know, we have basically limited ownership in Canada, limited control. We've inherited this feudal system where the king has allodial ownership. And so the king is our superior landlord. And that is why, you know, the king through parliament and the legislature and the cities can basically keep taking away our control over property, which is, you know, basically losing ownership by 1,000 cuts. Now here we've got the UNRIP Act, and this is now writ large. Have you heard of the Cowichan decision?
No.
Okay, so the Cowichan tribe in British Columbia.
Yes, I have. Okay, never mind.
Okay, so they brought a court action for basically most of the city of Richmond, British Columbia. So if you've ever flown into Vancouver, Greater Vancouver, the airport's in the city of Richmond. So, you know, a lot of people live there, and they brought this. The Cowichan band brought this court action saying, well, we have native title. Now, the interesting thing is neither the province nor the government of Canada really defended the action. Now, and this is by design, because the plan now for those that direct our governments is basically to completely destroy our property rights so that they can remake us into a communist nation. I mean, it's so clear. They're here to destroy our property rights. And
just so to for those who may not know, I remember, I'm going to see if I can pull up my tweet from the time. This was Indigenous Aboriginal group brought basically a claim saying we own all of the land, including the private land on it, people's homes. And I remember people saying they had to send out a notice now to everybody within a certain perimeter. And the concern, although the assurance was, no, this does not mean the Indigenous tribe now owns people's private property. But what has come out of that decision since it was rendered?
Okay, so what happened is first of all, when the court proceedings were going on, the court actually made a ruling that they were not going to tell the citizens of Richmond whose property could be affected. And that in itself is really interesting. The province of British Columbia, they could have informed the property owners, and they chose not to. The government of Canada could have chose to let the property owners know, and they didn't. And all of this is happening in secret so that by the time it occurs, it's too late. And basically the court said, listen, we have Aboriginal title. They're right. The Cowichan Band has Aboriginal title. It overlays over top of, fee simple. I mean, if you pull your title on your house, it's going to say fee simple, which is just, remember, the king owns the land. The king's your superior landlord, but the king has granted you the right, that's the fee, to use the land. And simple just basically means without restriction, although every other level of government is now so restricting you that, really you don't have a lot of control anymore. So this is now overlaid over top. So nobody knows what it means, Viva. What we know for sure is the Cowichan Band has been granted Aboriginal title over these lands. My understanding is the property values have dropped by about half. Who's going to buy a property in Richmond? You can't mortgage them. The BC government, I'm told, is having to step in and, and basically, I guess, create mortgages. Because if you're a bank, you grant a mortgage, You know, Viva, that actually when you file a mortgage, title is transferred to the bank. It doesn't look that way on your title, but the bank owns it, and you just have the right of quiet possession and the equity and the like. So, but what bank is going to take the risk when they don't know what the ownership looks like? Now, let's talk about.
I'm pulling up my tweet because I did a video on it. I just forgot the name of the band, but this was when they basically were granted a possession, control, ownership over unceded land, and people didn't, I don't know, at the time fully appreciate. This was the notice that everyone got in the area. Please take note that the recent BC Supreme Court decision in Cowichan Tribes versus Canada made some important decisions that would negatively affect the title to your property. A briefing paper prepared by the City of Richmond staff is attached to your reference. If you look at the map, your property is located within the claim area outlined in green. For those whose property is in the area outlined in black, the court has declared Aboriginal title to your property, which may compromise the status and validity of your ownership. This was mandated without any proper prior notice. The entire area outlined in green is claimed by I can find this afterwards. And so they've actually sort of, I don't know whether or not they've acted on it, but the ownership and value consequences have in fact occurred now.
Yeah, no, you said something interesting. You said unceded. But when we look at the UNRIP Treaty and when we look at the UNRIP Act, it doesn't draw any distinction between ceded land, unceded land, land that, everyone agrees long ago the Crown paid over market value for in fair negotiations. It makes no distinction at all. Canada has obligated itself to basically give the Indigenous peoples ownership, use, control, possession of all of occupied Canada. And it begs the question, why would we possibly do this? Like, let's say you 100% buy the narrative that has been now generated for about 40 years. Like everyone should go back and read the 1970s book, Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky. This was planned long ago, because what could have happened is they didn't have to fund the narrative. They didn't have to prepare the narrative that the Indigenous people, are terribly oppressed, and we have to give them the land back and all of this. And again, whether you accept the narrative or don't accept the narrative, understand, like 40, 50 years ago, the government could have just been steady as she goes. No, we're not going there. And not funded that message, not supported groups that promote that message, not privileged that message. But a deliberate decision was made. So now a significant percentage of the Canadian population actually believes that this is an ethical issue, that we would have to grant Aboriginal people or Indigenous people basically title over almost all of Canada. So, and what's also interesting, Viva, is the courts, and that's why I say we're in a constitutional crisis, is the courts, over the years with the, Indigenous title cases have basically said, listen, Indigenous people cannot alienate their land except to the king. So if you're in the city of Richmond and now, the Cowichan band has this title over your land, you can't even buy your house from them. You can't even say, listen, this house, was worth $1 million. I'll give you $1 million, grant me title. You can't. Do you see the problem? If we're going to grant Indigenous title over the entire nation, and that can't be alienated, we are forever institutionalizing property racism, where, at most 5% of the population has a special title to the entire populated part of the nation. And how is that going to end well? I mean, I want to live in a country where everyone is equal, where we abhor racism. And here we're finding ourselves in this constitutional crisis where we are institutionalizing property racism forever. And, again, like we're talking at most 5% of the population. And it doesn't matter whether you think that the historical narrative that we're being given, because, you know, it's a little convenient, and, you know, hundreds of years of history and different bands and different situations, it's always more nuanced than that. But if you buy it 100%, is the way to right the wrong basically destabilizing the entire nation and this structure of property ownership we rely on for our prosperity?
I got to bring it up because we discussed it as the possibility at the time. This is from March 2026, so it's not like this is an old. This is new now after the consequences have been there. And it says appraisers say land claim enrichment could be reducing property values as much as 30 to 40%. So it's not saying it might do it in the future. What it's basically saying is there is a reduction, and the idea is it might be related to the land claim. And some BC appraisers are warning that the negative public perception caused by the Cowichan land title case and uncertainty over its impacts could lower private land values in the part of Richmond covered by the decision by as much as 30 to 40%. I presume that case is under appeal, or is it? Because if the government was sort of...
It is. And I think because of the fact that there was no notice to the property owners, that, you know, in all fairness, there likely has to be a new trial. But it's predictable. This is predictable what happened. I mean, basically, our courts have said for sure over unceded land that there is Aboriginal title. Now we have the federal.
It's all unceded except for that which might have been ceded under a treaty, which they might argue the treaties were never respected anyhow, so null and void.
Well, listen, I mean, we're being groomed for this, and the courts have been groomed for this for a long time. So let's talk about these treaties. So first of all, did these chiefs who are going to negotiate with the Crown, did they have the authority to basically cede large tracts of land without consulting with their bands? Because they traveled to do this. I mean, so really, did they have that authority to do this? Did they even understand property ownership? Did they even understand what we're talking about as they communicated through interpreters? And then, you know, we would play the game in some cases where they show up and we wouldn't feed them for a couple of days, and then we would feed them. And there's this cultural, you know, obligation of reciprocity because of hospitality and all of that. And then, you know, over a short period of time, without any expert advice, you enter into binding treaties where, you know, you're giving over the island of Manhattan for some beads. Like, could you not see the court saying, you know, these really aren't valid treaties? But does it matter anyway? That's just one mechanism, is courts, you know, based on how this has progressed in the court system, saying, okay, this is unceded, there's Aboriginal title. Okay, this ceded land really isn't ceded, there's Aboriginal title. But we've got the government, and they recently did a deal with the Musqueam Nation because of UNRIP. We've got the government, and UNRIP, it doesn't matter ceded, unceded. It doesn't matter. Parliament has obligated themselves to overlay Indigenous title over the entire nation. I mean, I'm in Alberta, I'm Treaty 6, but I could wake up tomorrow and learn that there's been an agreement with, you know, the First Nations that are part of Treaty 6, because we've got this UNRIP obligation, which is now our law. We've got to transfer it all back, and it's overlaying Aboriginal title. And this is the plan. This is being done deliberately. They know what they're doing. They passed the law to do it. They just, you know, they released, it was public. Hey, we've reached an agreement with the Musqueam Nation, which covers, you know, about 2 million homes in the Lower Mainland. The Musqueam Nation, my understanding, is less than 2,000 people. But why are you, and you haven't read it, Viva, because they will not make it public. Now, my understanding is it's just the first step. So it's kind of the mechanism for them to grant them title. But understand, our federal government is in the process right now of taking steps to overlay Indigenous title over the entire nation. It's just BC's the low-hanging fruit. where this is happening. But how on earth would you be granting special inalienable property rights to 2,000 people where there's 2 million homes? Like how is that going to be good for anyone, let alone the Musqueam Band? Institutionalizing property racism, undermining our prosperity, which is built on property rights, destroying property values, basically creating this complexity where now the king is your superior landlord and an Aboriginal band is also your, or bands are your superior landlords, is not going to help anyone. So the bigger question is, why are we doing this?
It'll help the government. It'll help usher in, like, I don't even know if the federal government comes in now and says, we're going to expropriate the land for the benefits of the indigenous tribes that have title to it. I'm trying to think of how it plays out, because even when it comes to reservations, the tribe, I don't know if they have ownership over the land, but they can't attribute individual ownership to individual natives who live on reserves. It's been one of the biggest complaints against reservations since their inception. How does this play out at a national scale? Because I presume it would be the same thing, and so it'll end up, being ultimately, through whatever mechanism, expropriated by the federal government. And as the cliche goes, you'll own nothing and maybe be happy about it.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think it's a new twist on, how do you institute a communist state? Like all the shakings undermining the church and the family and, sexual identity, all of and basically diluting us. So, where we're not a uniform culture anymore. They're doing all that shaking, but it's the property. They've got to get rid of property rights. And it's really brilliant. So instead of just passing a law saying we're abolishing private property, they are basically going to dilute it and confuse it so that the middle class has no meaningful equity. They have no meaningful power to resist. And, and that's just one branch of what's happening. I mean, they're destroying our property rights in several ways. So, yeah, no, this is absolutely, a brave new world, and pun intended, with the Huxley novel, right?
I'm going to read this out here. This is Article 26. Indigenous peoples have the right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, all of them, occupied or otherwise used or acquired. This is item 2. Indigenous peoples have the right to own, use, develop, and control the lands, territories, and resources that they possess by reason of traditional ownership or other traditional occupation or use, as well as those which they have otherwise acquired. Part 3. States shall give legal recognition and protection to these lands, territories, and resources. Such recognition shall be conducted with due respect to the customs, traditions, and land tenure systems of the indigenous peoples concerned. We'll get to 27 in a second. And I just, was looking it up. It looks like when this passed originally, it was, let's see here. The nays were 118 to the yays of 210. This is in 2021. The implementing this into Canadian law, and it looks like it was mostly conservative. I don't know if that's all the conservatives that were there at the time. The question was this, and I don't know if you know it offhand: did this UNRIP document play a role in the Richmond court case?
No, I don't think it did. So I don't think it did, and it. But that that was one of the longest court cases in the world, and I don't know the record. I mean, I certainly wouldn't hurt the case to add that as part of the record to say, well, we also have a United Nations obligation to do this. So I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was part of the argument.
Well, and so nonetheless, either way, so UNRIP now, UN issues this declaration. I've been watching all of the propaganda videos over it. They're talking about indigenous rights to self-determination. And basically, I mean, the amount of videos I've seen where it's not even code. It's just a euphemism for, we're going to take back the entire territory, Australia, from the Europeans who conquered it. However you feel about that morally, history does not need to be moral in order to be history. Undo all of the basic modern rights of ownership so that the indigenous peoples can effectively take back what was lost through the conquest of time. what other provisions are of particular concern or interest in the UNRIP?
Well, but can I just, I mean, I'm focusing on the property thing, but can we just take a step back and, because you're basically, outlining the real problem is, and it's not just Canada, but let's talk about Canada, is where we're basically obligated to give all of the property back and take it back from the Europeans. And there's kind of two issues here and again, and I don't care where you are in accepting the official narrative that, basically there's this historic wrong to be righted. It's 2026. There are 41 million Canadians, and all of us have grown up with this property rights system. We've built our society on it. Is the answer to, right some historical wrong to basically give all of this title back? That's madness. Like, so even if there was a historical wrong to right, that's madness. I mean, and we're institutionalizing this forever. We're basically ensuring that there's going to be two types of people in Canada. There's going to be this privileged minority based on race that has these special property rights that the rest of us can never have. Constitutionally, we can never have them. I mean, even the fact that we can't even buy it from them, they cannot alienate that from ourselves. This is a constitutional crisis that must be solved, and it's absolute madness that we're here.
Let me play this. This is, I'll just play a minute of this because it's one of the videos I was watching earlier. This is from the United Nations website. Just listen to about a minute.
The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted by the United Nations in 2007.
The draft resolution A/61/L67 is adopted.
It took more than 20 years of negotiation. It's a specific and the first of its kind within the United Nations that recognize the historical injustices that Indigenous people suffered from, that sets norms and principles for redressing those injustices. It also contains very strong rights for Indigenous people, notably the right to self-determination, which is, I would say, the core or the pillar of Indigenous rights, recognized internationally to Indigenous peoples as nations and as peoples to determine their destiny, to decide on what their education system would be, their health system would be, how they want to project themselves in the future.
I'm going to pause it there because, when I'm listening to that, what catches my ear is that was intended to be the purpose of reservations. When Indigenous peoples, I say it without judgment, when they say we want to preserve our culture and we want our own lands. And so the federal government says, well, we own all of this. Now we can make some treaties. We'll give you some lands. You could live traditionally, culturally as you did, appreciating the arguments that some of them were traditionally, culturally traveled freely, fished in rivers and occupied or passed on many, massive pieces of land. They say, well, you get your reservations, and that's where you can decide your own education system, your own health system. It turns out to be god-awful, atrocious, the not even clean drinking water, which they then blame on the federal government. But that was supposed to be what the idea of reservations were. What they're describing now is not just expanding reservations, turning the country into a reservation now, that the entire infrastructure, natural resources, and property rights are then bestowed by this UN declaration onto the Indigenous peoples of various lands, which is one thing until those national governments institute this, implement it, and ratify it by way of domestic law.
Yeah, and did you see in that clip? So I mean, we've been focusing on land ownership because to me that's the most significant part. But basically, it's granting them to have a completely separate society, education, social self-determination. That's really interesting. And again, it's completely institutionalizing racism. So Canada will forever be a two-tier system, only we're going to turn it around where a very teeny minority is absolutely privileged over everyone else. And ironically, and it may be just desserts, is the other UN initiative, One Health, and they're quite clear they want to clear us off the land. and they want to get us into 15-minute cities. So, I mean, we're going to end up in reservations where, we can't leave. Before the Bill of Rights, if you were an Indigenous person, you couldn't leave the reserve without an Indian agent giving you written permission to leave the reserve. And we're going to find ourselves in 15-minute cities where we can't leave without permission. Maybe it's going to be just deserts, but it's not. We're all going to be impoverished. We're all going to be enslaved. It's not going to be good for the Indigenous people to basically destroy one of the most prosperous nations on earth, what should be clearly the most prosperous nation on earth by far because of our resources and education and the culture that we did have. There's no reason why Canada can't be the absolute strongest, most prosperous nation in the world. But we're going to destroy that and all, lose our rights, lose our individual liberties and freedoms. And they're using this just as a pretext. They don't care about the Indigenous peoples. There's no love there. And if the Indigenous peoples think that there's love there, they just need to look historically and ask, because leopards don't change their spots. So now it's become a political advantage to be using this issue to destabilize the nation.
Well, and now that I'm thinking, out loud, when Chris Cooper was on talking about the Chinese influence in Canada, and not just in Canada, but specifically in reservations, you wonder how. I'll think about this for a little bit, but how this can be manipulated by foreign governments, especially adversarial ones like the Chinese Communist Party, who might already have tentacles in, or means of influence in with certain Indigenous tribes, certain areas, who can then manipulate the Canadian government to basically say, give it all to them so that we can have our tentacles in it. What is? I mean, sorry, go for it.
Well, I can't get my head around. How is, and this is the point I'm making, is again, let's say there's this historical wrong, which I think if we really had a fair look at it, it's a little more nuanced. You can never take something down to a simple narrative. But let's say there's this historical wrong we have to right. What federal government in their right minds can possibly think that the answer is totally undermining our property rights and overlaying Aboriginal titles? So 5% at best of the population basically has all these special rights. And how do we get there unless our government already is not making decisions that have anything to do with the welfare of the nation? Because you don't need to be a rocket scientist here to see that this is going to be a train wreck. Could you imagine some other country asking Parliament, say, Canada's got its act together. We're thinking of, yes, we've inherited this property system, and we even, have a torrents registry. It's very simple. And but we're thinking of giving this, 5% of population based on race, special ownership rights that will overlay, and they'll become the superior landlord. They can never alienate it. This is going to be institutionalized forever. We think that that's going to make us prosperous and free. We go there. Are you nuts? Are you mad? You don't even have to think about it. And you'd say, well, first of all, that's racist, because racism is privileging one group based on race. That's racism, treating people different based on race. And we're going to institutionalize racism based on property rights. You're basically saying that nobody, it doesn't matter whether you came from India or Pakistan or England or Germany or Ireland, nobody but Aboriginal people, Indigenous people, can actually have full ownership of property. And they may not even be able to have full ownership of property, because you've already brought up this problem that they can't kind of alienate it from the collective.
Uh-huh.
Well, you tell me that sure sounds like communism, doesn't it? Except, we're now an animal farm where, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. You can't make this stuff up, but it's destabilizing. And there's no way our government's acting in the interest of the nation. So we're in nation destruction. And this is, you can't look at this and disagree with that.
I want to just do a couple things here, cover a couple things before, apparently it played a small supplemental role in the Richmond case. I was looking to see whether or not it played any role in the recent Alberta case that set aside or quashed the petition of the citizens' petition for separation on the basis that they didn't consult with the Indigenous, because that, you know, is one of the obligations created
No,
by.
I read that decision and I don't recall seeing UNRIP there.
No,
But you know, we were fully into, and I mean, let's talk about that decision, because this, you know, this is where we're arriving with our court system. So just so that people understand what happened, what you're talking about is, so in the province of Alberta, there's this act that allows citizens to submit referendum questions, which, you know, creates an obligation on the government to have a referendum, and you have to basically get 10% of, you know, signatures, 10% of the number of people that voted in the last election. And so that happened. So on a question about whether or not Alberta should separate from Canada, now the electoral officials haven't validated the count, but we all expect that they've crossed this threshold. But we had a court case where some Indigenous bands were saying it's actually unconstitutional for this referendum to go ahead because of Section 35. And just going by memory, Viva, you know, one of the points is, you know, first of all, it would violate the Constitution because the treaty agreements are with the Crown, and right, you know, that Canada's now stepped in, but it was with the Crown, and now it's, you know, in the Crown represented by Canada, and we would actually be violating Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982 if we substituted Alberta. Another one of that I recall is, you know, they have the rights of mobility to hunt and fish and use their traditional lands, and putting an international border between Alberta and Saskatchewan and Alberta and BC would hinder those mobility rights, and that would be another constitutional violation. And there was a third one I don't recall now. But what's interesting about that is so what it means is, if you take that to its logical conclusion, is we no longer have self-determination. So, you know, what's the Indigenous population of Alberta? 3%. So what it means is now 3% basically can control, if we follow this to its logical conclusion, it means that 97% don't have the right of self-determination. That's a constitutional crisis. We've basically found ourselves in this box that likely wasn't anticipated as we kind of went down this historical narrative. And Viva, let me ask you, you know, because you were a lawyer, you're legally trained. I mean, is this convincing to you that the federal crown, that the king actually has the authority to now take away our property rights in 2026? Because as I understand it, and I'm simplifying things, but like hundreds and hundreds of years ago, this wooden ship with sails arrived on the East Coast, and they had a Union Jack flag, and they planted it on the ground, and somehow that meant that the Queen or the British monarch owns the land, like all of Canada. Like it really is as simple as that. Like, sure, we had colony, and sure, you know, maybe feudal land rights somehow got imposed. Well, really, is that convincing? And, you know, maybe we didn't have a war, but really, wasn't it technological and military conquest at the end of the day, although we called it something else? Now, there was this European international, some countries that signed a treaty saying, oh yeah, you can go and seize whatever lands you want, but really, we're going to accept that today in 2026? And there might have been a papal, you know, declaration saying Christians can conquer heathen lands if they're, you know, basically going to turn them Christian. I mean, is that convincing? Like, how does the king have the right to take our land away now? That's the question I'm asking. Do we really accept they have authority?
You know, well, the answer to your question is yes, and I remember it from reading the Quarantine Act for the first time when the COVID hit, and Section 8.1 said any person in charge of a place shall, at the request of the minister, provide that place to the minister if, in the opinion of the minister, the temporary use of that place as a quarantine facility is necessary. I said, like, oh, crap. So private property can be, it always could be expropriated by the government.
But the point I'm making is we can say the emperor has no clothes. Like, the point I'm making is really, if you sit down and look at it, the idea that the king really has allodial ownership of all of Canada, there's really no legal base for it other than the exercise of force, which is then conquest. But now we're pretending that something else happened. But there's no legal basis. And why do we accept that the courts and the federal government can now basically destroy our nation in 2026 and say you don't have property rights? Like, can't we just say no? Can't we just admit we're in a constitutional crisis and say, no, there's 41 million of us. We now need to structure ourselves. Now that we're here all together, how do we structure ourselves so that we have the most prosperous and free nation in the world going forward? And it's not what we're doing. But if we don't recognize we're in a constitutional crisis and our system is not going to work for us, it's actively destroying us, it's going to destroy us, we will be destroyed. We have to, so step one is we have to accept that we're in a constitutional crisis that we just kind of bumbled into historically. And we need to figure out now, okay, how do we structure going forward? But in my mind, it's not saying this small group of people that we call members of parliament and judges can absolutely destroy our way of life and impoverish us and, institutionalize property racism until, enough of the population gets totally fed up that they say, how do we do this better? We should ask that question now, understand we're in a crisis, understand that no, courts, you're not doing this, and no, federal government, we're not going to honor these treaties because this isn't the answer. Institutionalizing property racism is not how you fix Canada.
Well, I say, Shawn, from your mouth to God's ears, it's going to have to get to a judge first, and we'll see what they do.
But
Shawn,
we know what they're going to do.
I know we know what they're going to do. Then you got to go to the higher lower
choice.
courts. Then you got to go to the appeals. Then you got to get to the Supreme Court of Canada. Hope they get it right. And if they don't, you either vote your way out harder, or Canada looks like Venezuela in 5 to 7 years, if that.
Mm-hmm.
Shawn, where can people find the work that you do, and what can they do to support you?
Okay, so I put in nhppa.org here, and I hope I can come back and talk to you about our drug prison and our corporatism, which is equally as shocking. So if you subscribe to that newsletter, so for example, we're having an event on this property rights on UNRIP on June 27th. And if you subscribe to our newsletter, we'll let you know. And we're also going to live stream it. So it's in Onaway.
This is the correct website that we're looking at, right?
Yeah, that's the correct website.
Okay.
So at nhppa.org, that's kind of my main landing place. But this event, we're going to have Professor Bruce Party from Queen's University speaking there. We're going to have Leighton Gray, who's a lawyer in Alberta with expertise in Aboriginal affairs. And then I'm also going to be speaking. So it's an extremely high caliber kind of day event. It starts at noon, and if you can't be in Onaway, we're going to live stream it. This is how you're going to find it. I also have my own channel, Shawn Buckley Law. So you can find me on X, you can find me on Substack. I wrote a Substack article on this, so Shawn Buckley Law, and and put it out, share this stuff, because it's funny, Viva, I wasn't planning on getting into this land rights issue. It's just, I was invited to speak, at a couple of events like the Elk Commission and in Alberta and the Ontario Land Owners Association in Ontario. And I start looking at this and I'm going, we're much closer. We're much closer to this, basically totally. To me, waking up and realizing I've lost the equity in my home and it's too late for me to leave the country because I'll have no equity to buy anything. Like I actually got quite concerned. I didn't realize how far down the path we were because nobody's talking about this.
Well, I'm going to invite everyone to put it on blast. I'm going to clip this entire
yes.
interview and put it on YouTube. Yep.
And my wife's just in the background going, okay, you got to talk about June 4th. So on June 4th, and I cannot tell you what it is, but June 4th, 10 o'clock Eastern time, we're going to live stream from nhppa.org a press conference on something that is huge, Viva. You will want to cover it. A whole bunch of other people are going to want to cover it. We think that it could be a game changer for the nation. I can hardly believe that this event's going to happen, but we cannot speak about it until June 4th. So
okay, you'll text me, remind me before, and I will live stream.
We will remind you before. And what a pleasure. I just, I so respect what you do and the difference you're making. So thanks for having me. I enjoyed the conversation and keep up.
No, it's fantastic. I just hope I'm making the slightest bit of difference. I don't know. Sometimes it feels like you're screaming into a void, and sometimes it feels like I guess the worst thing is feeling like you're spinning your wheels to get nowhere. So I just hope we're getting somewhere, and I'm going to put this on blast, and we'll get people talking about it. Whether or not Canada's too far gone, at least it can serve as a warning to America if we want to be cynical. But Shawn, it's amazing. You'll come back on for sure. And June 4th, you'll text me and remind me. And now I'm going to get to I'll get to the Rumble rants that I won't necessarily read with you here, but it was amazing. And I'll pin your links in the top now so that everybody knows where to find you.
Super. Really appreciate that.
My pleasure. Talk to you soon.
Yep.
All right. Bye-bye. There's a couple. I'm getting to the tip questions. I just don't want to, I don't like doing them when the guest is here. It feels a little dirty to get into. Oh, Bill Talk.